welcome to Macros with Mythili, our weekly program where we take a hard look at all the recent major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Once in a while, however, we look ahead and try to read the tea leaves, and that's what we're trying to do in this episode of Macros with Mythili. We're going to look ahead and see if we can come to some kind of consensus on what to expect from the report of the 7th Pay Commission, which is due any time now. And more importantly, look at the likely impact of those recommendations on the government's finances. Will the recommendations of the 7th Pay Commission do as much damage to the fisc as the 5th and the 6th Pay Commissions? Can we really afford that damage at this juncture? What can we do to mitigate that damage? Are pay commissions a necessary evil? We're going to try and answer those questions and more with our panel of experts, Dr. C Rangarajan, eminent economist who has held almost every senior post possible, including that of Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council under the UPA government, T.T. Ram Mohan, Professor, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and Ashok Jha, former Finance Secretary, Government of India. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Dr. Rangarajan, if I may start with you, leaving aside the issue of the impact of the Pay Commission recommendations on the finances of the government, is there really a case for these regular pay commissions, given the fact that there is no such thing in the private sector and also that government salaries are already indexed to inflation?
I really do not think that it is necessary. After all, the administrative structure remains the same. The DNS allowance takes care of whatever is happening with respect to the rise in inflation. Therefore, given this situation, without any fundamental change in the administrative structure, I do not see the need for a periodic revision of the scales of pay and etc. But I do think that there is a need for some adjustment because today the DNS allowance is in excess of what is called the basic pay. Therefore, at some particular point when the DA is really in excess of the basic pay, some adjustments must be made in the salary structure. So, with some minimal changes, every 5-year or 10-year, some adjustment can be made. But a fundamental relook at every scale of pay and all that is not, in my opinion, warranted since the administrative structure remains the same. Of course, there are issues like how to incentivize the present administrative structure, how to reward people who perform extremely well, how to improve the productivity of the system. And also, in general, at the lower and the middle level, the emoluments of the government servants or the government employees is not is as good as it is elsewhere. But there are some specific jobs and some specific areas in which unless the emoluments are competitive with the private sector, we may not be able to get the right kind of persons. So how to address those issues? But the general issue of how to incentivize the system is important. But a general increase in the pay scales and all that is not really what is required, particularly if it is steep. I think it has an impact on the fisc. I think that is critically important.
Okay. TTR, Dr. Rangarajan says that given that there is no change in the administrative structure and that salaries are indexed to inflation, government salaries are indexed to inflation, there is really no case for a regular pay commission which hikes salaries across the board for government employees. Would you agree with his assessment?
It's difficult to do away entirely with the pay commission. I mean, you may want to make its task less cumbersome, perhaps. They can be a little more focused in what they are doing. But you see, the need basically arises because at the top echelons of government, you're competing with the same pool of manpower for which the private sector is competing. So some sort of benchmarking with the private sector is required, at least for what you call the A grade level in government. And you know, in government itself, pay tends to rise rather slowly relative to that in the private sector. I mean, if you there'd be there's a 2.5% increment every year, and if you add to that DNS allowance increase of about 5%, we are talking of an annual increase in pay about 7.5–8%. Whereas in the private sector, because the pay scales are now today almost globalized, the benchmarks are global at the top, the jumps in pay have been exponential. We're talking about $1 million salaries and so on. So I'm not saying that you need to catch up with that, but without some sort of benchmarking with the private sector, it will become extremely difficult for government to attract to attract people into the higher echelons and to specialist jobs, engineers, doctors, and so on. Now, of course, the problem arises, as Dr. Rangarajan sort of mentioned, because the pay commissions tend to offer across the board hikes, but even that cannot be entirely avoided in the government scheme of things, because the norm is to have a certain ratio between the maximum and minimum pay. And if you agree that pay at the top needs to go up in order to catch up with the private sector, then there's very little you can do to prevent pay at the bottom also from rising. But I agree with Dr. Rangarajan that it doesn't have to be such an elaborate exercise, and if you can create some sort of benchmarks within the system and allow for periodic revision, at least at particular levels, then it doesn't have to be such an elaborate exercise.
Ashok, let me toss that question to you. We've heard Dr. Rangarajan as well as TTR. Do you think there really is a case for regular pay commissions, given, as I said, the fact that government salaries are already indexed fully, mind you, to inflation?
No, I don't think that comparison is really correct, because private sector salaries have been increasing very rapidly. For instance, when I retired from the government, my executive assistant in Hyundai was getting the salary that I was getting as Secretary to the Government of India. So, there is no such comparison that one can make, because inflation is only one aspect of it. The other aspect is that, the responsibilities of government officers and people working in government are much more than what most people in the private sector have to face. So I don't think that, the view that you don't need a pay commission is really a very valid one.
Okay, so it need not be such an elaborate exercise. At the same time, we need to think in terms of some kind of parity with the private sector, as what TTR says. Dr. Rangarajan is slightly less charitable towards the public sector government employees, rightly so I would think, but I'm afraid on that note we have to slip into a very short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the possible recommendations to be made by the 7th Pay Commission and its likely impact on the government's fisc. Dr. Rangarajan, before the break, TTR said that, it's important that government is able to attract talent, and therefore some kind of parity is required by the private sector. But the fact is that higher salaries in the private sector are only the very top, and those are people who really prove their worth, whereas in the government, it's basically time scale driven. So can one really always aim for parity, and should we have something else? Because there are so many other non-monetary compensations that are there in the public sector, which are not there in the private sector at all. Most important, security.
Yes, I think security is important. All that I wanted to say was that in the middle and the lower level, the government employees' emoluments are comparable with what is happening in the private sector also. It is only in the very top level where the talent is scarce that the real problem arises. Therefore, we need to address that particular problem. But whereas pay commissions have generally been addressing a general issue of trying to raise the salary of everybody, I think this is that is a question that has to be posed before any pay commission or any committee which looks into it. Certainly, there is a case for people with specific talents, with specific capabilities, to be compensated adequately. But how that it can be done within a government system is also a very difficult issue. For example, incentivizing and productivity increases are difficult to measure also in a system in which decision making is complex. To identify individuals who have performed well is also very difficult to do. But some system of incentivization is required. Otherwise, everybody stands in the same queue and gets promoted after a certain point of time. So these are issues which I think need to be addressed by any committee which looks into these matters.
TTR, Dr. Rangarajan agreed with you, but only partially. He says we do need to have some system of incentivizing so that we can attract top talent. But if I could ask you, speaking of yourself, you have opted to remain with IIM Ahmedabad, even though there are so many private universities which have come up, which would offer you many times perhaps your present salary. So clearly there are some compensations, even at the top level in the government sector, that make up for the lower cash in hand. Would you agree, or would you still say it becomes difficult for the public sector to attract talent?
Well, I'm not saying that government salaries need to be on par with the salaries in the private sector. That's completely unrealistic. All I'm saying is that you need to benchmark with respect to the private sector. You may consciously opt to be 1/10 in terms of the cash package of the private sector, but there has to be some sort of benchmarking. Now it's true, of course, that in the public sector you have all kinds of compensation. I mean, you're compensated in various ways. I mean, there's the prestige of the job, there's the challenge of the job itself, there's job security, the housing benefits, there is pension. So by all means you can look at the cost to the organization in government and then compare with the private sector, and you can opt to have you can opt to settle for some fraction of what the private sector is offering. But the starting point has to be to take into account what is happening in the private sector. You cannot be completely unmindful of that. And of course, part of the problem which we are completely ignoring is that the pay in the private sector has spiraled completely out of control, which is globally speaking the central issue. I mean, the US and also in many places in Europe, the public policy question is how do you rein in private sector pay, which seems to have it seems to be in many ways divorced from performance, and that's what much of the Thomas Piketty's book is all about. So I think we need to sort of be mindful of that aspect as well.
Dr. Rangarajan, TTR says that private sector salaries at the top level have really spiraled completely, and the question is how do we rein that in? But I thought you had also raised the issue that in the private sector, if salaries are high, they're linked with productivity. Whereas in the government sector, as you yourself mentioned, it's very difficult to ensure that link with productivity. In fact, the 14th Finance Commissioner has said future pay commissions should be called pay and productivity commissions. So how do we ensure that there is some link between salaries and productivity?
Well, in terms of benchmarking with the private sector, there is clearly a case with respect to public sector employees and the private sector employees. They are doing similar jobs, they are working in the same environment, and perhaps the issue is more relevant with respect to public sector employees. There are banks which are in the public sector, there are banks in the private sector, and the chairman of the public sector banks are paid, which is way below what is being paid in the private sector. Now, how do we how much does the other factors like being part of the government, having the security of tenure and all that compensate for it is not easy to find. But therefore, as far as civil servants are concerned, I think they do enjoy a lot of what we might call intangible perquisites. They have the power as well as the opportunity to do a lot of good. At a very young age, some people become, if they belong to the civil service, to head the whole district administration. That opportunity doesn't come easily in the private sector. Therefore, there are pluses which a civil servant enjoys, not only in terms of perquisites, but in terms of the able to influence in a wide area. Therefore, there is a satisfaction that comes from that, which will compensate for monetary benefits. Therefore, I think, but the whole point is that how to incentivize is a very difficult issue, because the measurement of productivity within the government or measurement of productivity is very difficult to do. But certainly some assessment can be made of superior qualities. Even now it is happening in a limited way at the topmost level when people are made secretary to the government. I think some kind of a selection is being made. where assessment is made of different people. Some are selected, some are not selected. But over a long period of time, it's a routine movement. That is where people who are experts in the field need to address the issue.
Ashok, are these comparisons with the private sector really valid, given that in the private sector it's only the very top that get those huge salaries, and there also it's very closely linked to performance, and there's no such link to productivity or performance in the government sector?
In fact, what the pay commission should actually be doing, which I think the 5th pay commission tried to do, was to cut down the number of people in the government. See, the whole approach has to be not only to increase salaries, but the approach has to be to ensure that the right kind of people are there in the government for the right kind of jobs. So if you look at the government employment today, the civilian employment, there are about 3 million employees in central government. Of this 3 million, you have about 85% that belong to categories C and D. Now, these are people who are, say, drivers, peons, clerks, and so on. Now, if there is no point in government increasing the numbers of such people, in fact, the 5th pay commission, if you recall, had suggested that there should be an attrition of about 2 to 2.5% per year, so that the number of people in the government is trimmed by about 30% over a 10-year span. I think that is the kind of approach that really should be there, that you basically, the pay commission should not just be a forum where you just hike salaries of people. There has to be a very strong restructuring that must accompany these pay increases. Because, for instance, now if you have in the government, say, 2 stenographers to attach to senior officers, you don't need that many. In fact, all officers should learn how to type and should be able to handle their own computers or laptops. So there is a real need for restructuring, so that you limit the number, get in people of the right kind of skills that are required, but you must pay people at the top adequate salaries, otherwise there won't be proper level of people joining the government.
Absolutely. So I think there is, both TTR as well as Dr. Rangarajan and Dr. Jha agree that there is some case for linking salaries with productivity. But I'm afraid on that note we have to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the possible fallout of the 7th Pay Commission recommendations. Of course, the report is not out as yet, but we are trying to lead the tea leaves for you. Dr. Rangarajan, let me now come to the most important aspect of the Pay Commission's recommendations, the possible fallout on the finances of the government. If you remember, after the 5th Pay Commission, the World Bank had described it as the single largest adverse development to the government's finances. The same thing happened with the 6th. Can we now afford a similar hit to our finances from the 7th?
I think the result of the 6th Pay Commission was on the fisc was quite severe. I mean, actually the salaries and wages and the pension benefits shot up very much. Of course, within the civil servants, some got more benefits than others, but on average it was very high. And because of the arrears to be paid towards the first 2 years, the burden in 2008, 9 and 9, 10 went up very, very sharply. And in fact, as a consequence of that, the central government fiscal deficit, which was only about 2.5% in the previous year, that is 2007-8, touched 6% in 2008-9 and went up to 6.3% in 2009-10. I also recognize that in 2008-9 and 2009-10, there was fiscal stimulus also in the wake of the international financial crisis. But certainly, both in the case of the states and in the center, the fiscal deficit went up very sharply. There was a very abrupt increase. In fact, the overall fiscal deficit went to 9.4% in 2009-10, which is really a very high figure. And many state governments were in dire situation. They had no option but to sort of implement in a modified way the Central Pay Commission's recommendations. They had no choice at all. They had to do it, but their finances were very, very weak. So as a consequence of all of that, the fiscal burden became very high. I do hope that when the 7th Pay Commission releases its report, it will recognize the impact that it will impose on the fisc. As I said earlier, some modest increase, some adjustment is appropriate, is perhaps needed. But any sharp increase will have the impact of pushing up the fiscal deficit once again, and perhaps can also add to the inflationary pressures in the system.
Absolutely, Dr. Rangarajan, you really hit the nail on the head. But TTR, if I can toss the same question to you, what is the likely impact on the fisc, and can we afford such a hit to the fisc at this particular juncture?
There is bound to be an adverse impact as a result of the Pay Commission recommendations, but my own assessment is that this impact tends to be hugely exaggerated. And I don't mind saying that there's a fair bit of scaremongering on the subject of the impact of the Pay Commission on the fisc. So let me just cite some numbers which will help substantiate the point I'm trying to make, which is rather counterintuitive, I know. In 2001-2, if you look at the ratio of pay and allowances and pension, the central government as a proportion of GDP, it was 1.9%, and it rose to 2.3% in 2009-10 after the award of the 6th Pay Commission. But by 2012-13, this figure had come down to 1.8%. So this is the point I would make, which is that there is an immediate impact for a couple of years, maybe for 3 years or so, and then over time the economy tends to digest the impact quite easily. If you're looking at the impact of the forthcoming Pay Commission, I've just made some rough computations which suggest that the problem is not half as severe as is commonly made out. If you look at the share of wages, pay and allowances of central and state government as a proportion of GDP, it's about 5%, 1% at the central level and 4% of GDP at the state level. Now the last Pay Commission effected a hike effectively of about 13% in pay. So even if I take an increase of 15% under the 7th Pay Commission, 15% of 5% is about 0.75% of GDP. So that will be the one-off impact. If you sort of amortize it over 5 years, which is a more reasonable way of looking at the situation, the impact is about 0.15% of GDP. So let's say 0.2%. I think that is something that
I think Dr. Rangarajan had a slightly different perspective. Dr. Rangarajan, you were telling me the impact was about 30%.
Yes,
so what is your number?
Yes, I think in fact, I have the numbers for pension numbers. In 2007-8, it was 24,000 crores, and it shot up to 32,000 crores in 2008-9 and 42,000 in 9-10. Actually, the increase in 2008-9 and 9-10 was close to 30%. In the wages and salaries. You can check it, but I couldn't get the numbers directly, but I do recall it was very high, partly because of the arrears. Now let us say if it is 20% increase, then 2 years arrears would, let us say, would mean another 10% compensation. So it went up by 30%. My only point is, yes, it is true that as a percentage of GDP, it goes up for 2 years, then it comes down. In fact, the reason why it happened was this was also the period which was marked by fairly substantial rate of growth in the economy. Because 8, 9, 9, 10 and all that, 8.2, 8.3%. Therefore, if the economy grows faster, yes, it may be able to absorb. But every 5 years or something, the fiscal deficit and the burden keeps increasing for 1 or 2 years, and then it comes down. And all that I'm saying really is that it is important to realize whether such a thing is needed or not. I think that is the fundamental issue that we need to address.
Ashok, you've been Finance Secretary to Government of India, and you've really seen the true impact of these recommendations on the government finances. What do you think we should do with the 7th Pay Commission recommendations to ensure that the government's fisc is not damaged beyond repair?
If the country wants proper governance, you must pay people well so that you get the proper kind of people in the government. I agree that the teeth to tail ratio in the government is very adverse. The tail is far too long and the teeth is not adequately powerful or strong enough. So you need to basically correct that imbalance. But to say that you don't need to pay government people better, I think would not be a correct assessment, because in my view, government people are shouldering very, very onerous responsibilities for what I would categorize as a mere pittance by way of salaries that they get. And since I have worked now in both the government as well as the private sector, I do have a perspective of what are the kind of responsibilities that are attached to both kinds of sectors. And I'm afraid the private sector responsibilities in terms of what one is supposed to do are far less than what a very senior officer in the government has to do.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of this discussion because that's all the time we have in this show. Clearly, Dr. Rangarajan has a slightly harsher view, if I can put it that way, on the impact of the Pay Commission's recommendations on the government's fisc in particular. I think Ashok and TTR are a little bit kinder, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have. We have to kind of call it a day. Thank you so much, Dr. Rangarajan, Ashok as well as TTR, for being on the panel with me. Thank you also for watching. We'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.